For Caspian, the 28th Earl of Ravenwood, the summons to his father's deathbed was not an appeal for filial comfort, but the final, damning chapter in a lifetime of profligacy and neglect. The old Earl, a man who had gambled away a fortune that had taken 10 generations to build, lay amidst the faded grandeur of his London townhouse, the scent of expensive failing medicine thick in the air. His last command was not a request, it was a sentence. Caspian was to marry. The bride, a Miss Lydia Hargreaves, was a woman he had never met, the daughter of a textile merchant whose burgeoning wealth was the only thing capable of keeping the debt collectors from the gates of Blackthorn Hall, his ancestral home. The name Hargreaves felt like grit in his mouth, the sound of looms and ledgers, a world away from the noble lineage of the Ravenwoods. The negotiation, if it could be called that, had been a humiliating affair conducted not by Caspian, but by his father's desperate solicitors. Caspian was merely presented with the terms, a contract as cold and binding as a set of iron shackles. Mr. Hargreaves, a man of shrewd business sense and burgeoning social ambition, would settle the entirety of the Ravenwood debt. In exchange, his only daughter Lydia would become the Countess of Ravenwood. She would have the title, the protection of an ancient name, and residence at the family seat. It was a trade. His history for her father's gold, his pride for his family's survival. Caspian had stormed through his father's house, the rage a hot, useless thing in his chest. He felt like a prize bull being sold at market, his bloodline the only asset of value. He imagined the woman, this Lydia. He pictured her in his mind as a caricature of the nouveau riche, a simple, plain girl, perhaps with a merchant's grasping hands, and a gaze that was either too bold or too timid, utterly lacking the innate grace of the aristocracy. He envisioned her draped in gaudy silks, her father's money had bought, a clumsy imitation of the ladies he knew. She would be a creature he could easily tuck away in some forgotten corner of his vast, crumbling estate. She was a secret to be managed, a shameful necessity, not a wife to be cherished, or even acknowledged. He would take the dowry, install its source in the North Tower, the most remote and least used wing of Blackthorn Hall. And then he would flee. London, the continent, anywhere. But there, the wedding day was a blur of gray skies and colder ceremony. It was a small, quiet affair, held in the family chapel at Blackthorn, a place that had not seen a wedding in 50 years. The guest list was sparse, a testament to the family's fall from grace. Caspian stood at the altar, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the stained glass window depicting a long-dead Ravenwood ancestor slaying a mythical beast. He did not look at his bride as she walked down the aisle. He heard the whisper of her dress, a simple silk that was surprisingly modest. He caught a faint scent of lavender, clean and unassuming. He felt her small, gloved hand in his, and it was steady, not trembling as he might have expected. During the vows, her voice was low but clear, a thread of unexpected steel woven through its softness. He, in turn, spoke his own lines with the clipped precision of a man reading a death warrant. He finally forced himself to look at her as he placed the ring, a plain gold band, not the ostentatious diamond he'd expected her to demand, on her finger. Her face was not plain. He registered with a distant sense of annoyance. It was quiet. Her features were fine, boned with a wide, intelligent brow, and serious gray eyes that met his without flinching. There was a stillness about her, a self-possession that did not fit his image of a grasping merchant's daughter. For a fleeting, unnerving moment, he felt a flicker of something other than scorn. It felt dangerously like curiosity, and he stamped it out with brutal efficiency. The wedding breakfast was an exercise in strained civility. Mr. Hargreaves was jovial, perhaps too much so, his satisfaction at the union palpable. Caspian drank his way through it, offering monosyllabic replies, and an aura of such frigid disdain that even the fires in the great hall seemed to shrink from him. He watched Lydia. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with a quiet dignity that rebuffed the pitying glances of his few remaining relations. She was a ghost at her own feast. As promised to himself, he left 3 days later. He had his steward, a dour man named Blackett, show her to her rooms in the North Tower, with instructions that she was to be given all she required for her comfort, but was not, under any circumstances, to be a presence in the main body of the hall. He packed his bags for London, for the cards and the wine and the women who offered distraction without complication. He thought he was shackling himself to a peasant. He could conveniently forget. He had no idea he was handing the keys to his dilapidated kingdom to its future, and far more capable, queen. 3 years of this sham marriage passed in a wall of cold silence. 3 years of her living like a ghost within his own walls. Now, as he returned to the brooding estate of Blackthorn Hall, forced back by legal matters his solicitors insisted he attend to in person, he expected to find only dust, decay, and the bitter memories of his disgrace. He never expected to find a ruler. Lydia, now the Countess of Ravenwood, stood at the window of the North Tower and watched the carriage carrying her husband thunder down the long, winding drive until it was just a speck disappearing into the misty Yorkshire landscape. The silence it left behind was profound, broken only by the cawing of rooks in the ancient oaks that lined the estate. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She was the trade bride, the interloper. Her meals were left on a tray outside her door, often cold. Her requests for books from the library were met with claims that the key had been misplaced. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Thorne, whose face seemed carved from granite, looked through her as if she were made of glass. For the first month, a deep, gnawing loneliness was her only companion. She had left behind a warm, loving home, a father who adored her, and a life of purpose in managing his household accounts, with a mind that was far sharper than society gave women credit for. Here, she was a prisoner in a gilded cage, the price paid for her family's social ascent. She would walk the prescribed corridors of her tower, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness, and feel the weight of centuries of Ravenwood history pressing down on her. The portraits of Caspian's ancestors, with their proud aristocratic faces, seemed to mock her from the walls. She cried until she had no tears left. And then, one morning, she stopped. Her father had not raised a victim. He had raised a survivor. Her campaign began not with a grand declaration, but with the smallest of gestures. She noticed the threadbare state of the servant's livery and the worn-out cloths used for cleaning, using a small allowance her father had insisted upon in the marriage contract. She placed an order with a local seamstress for new aprons for the maids and better uniforms for the grooms. When the items arrived, she did not have them distributed by the hostile Mrs. Thorne. She went to the servants' hall herself. The maids and footmen fell into a shocked silence as she entered. She simply presented the bundles, saying, "I thought these might be of more use than the old ones. It is difficult to take pride in one's work with poor tools." She then turned and left, ignoring the stunned expressions on their faces. Her next target was the kitchen. The cook, a man perpetually soured by a lack of quality ingredients, complained loudly that the budget provided by the steward was insufficient. Lydia, drawing on her experience from her father's household, requested the account ledgers from a reluctant Mr. Blackett. She spent 2 days poring over them in her cold room, her sharp mind quickly identifying gross inefficiencies and misplaced priorities. She drew up a new budget, one that reallocated funds from the stable's extravagant wine cellar, untouched since the old Earl's death, to the kitchens and the general upkeep of the servants' quarters. She presented it to Blackett, explaining her logic with calm, irrefutable clarity. The steward, a man who had served the Ravenwoods his entire life and resented her presence, was taken aback by her acumen. He could find no fault in her figures. Grudgingly, he approved the changes. The turning point with Mrs. Thorne came during a brutal winter storm that swept across the moors. A young laundry maid fell desperately ill with a lung fever. The household physician was miles away, and the roads were impassable. Panic began to set in. Lydia, hearing the commotion, came down from her tower. She found the girl shivering violently on a thin cot in the drafty servants' attic. Without a word, she ordered the girl moved to a warmer, unused guest room in the main wing, an act that directly contravened Caspian's orders. Mrs. Thorne began to protest, her voice sharp. Lydia met her gaze, her quiet authority more powerful than any shout. "She will die up here, Mrs. Thorne," she said simply. "If Lord Ravenwood wishes to dismiss me for saving a life, then so be it. But I will not stand by and watch this child perish from neglect." For the next 3 days, Lydia did not sleep. She brewed herbal remedies taught to her by her grandmother, sat by the girl's bedside, bathed her feverish brow, and coaxed spoonfuls of broth between her lips. Mrs. Thorne, initially watching with skepticism, found herself drawn into the vigil, fetching fresh linens and hot water, her rigid posture slowly softening as she witnessed the Countess's tireless devotion. When the girl's fever finally broke, and she awoke, weak but lucid, a profound change had occurred. Mrs. Thorne looked at Lydia, no longer with contempt, but with a dawning, grudging respect. From that day on, the housekeeper's reports to the absent Earl began to subtly change. Mentions of the master's wife were replaced with her ladyship, and the tone shifted from one of complaint to one of quiet admiration. Lydia had begun her silent, unseen reign, building a kingdom not on a foundation of title or wealth, but on a bedrock of competence and compassion. 3 years in London had done little to soothe Caspian's soul. He had chased oblivion in gambling dens that stank of stale cigar smoke and desperation, sought solace in the bottom of countless bottles of French brandy, and pursued fleeting, meaningless affairs with women whose laughter was as bright and empty as their eyes. He had become a fixture in certain circles of the ton, the brooding, ruined Earl, as tragic and handsome as a fallen god. His friends, men of similar standing and dissipation, encouraged his cynicism, sneering along with him at the concept of trade brides and the vulgarity of new money. Yet, at the end of every night, as he returned to his cold, lonely townhouse, the image of Blackthorn Hall would rise in his mind. It was his birthright, his legacy, and he was letting it rot, governed by a woman he refused to know. The summons from his solicitors was an unwelcome intrusion. There were leases to be renewed, tenants to be met with, and documents that required his actual, physical signature. His presence at Blackthorn was unavoidable. He undertook the journey north with a sense of profound dread, the carriage wheels churning up the mud of the Great North Road like they were churning up all the resentment he had so carefully cultivated. He pictured what he would find: dust sheets thick as shrouds over the furniture, gardens choked with weeds, and a resentful staff on the verge of open rebellion. He imagined the woman in the North Tower. His wife would have grown either bitter and shrewish, or fat and idle on his grudging hospitality. The thought gave him a grim, petty satisfaction. As the carriage ground to a halt under a bruised twilight sky, the first crack in his certainty appeared. The grand oak doors of Blackthorn Hall swung open not with a groan, but with a silent, well-oiled swing. A footman, crisp and alert in a new-looking uniform, was there to greet him. The entrance hall was not shrouded in gloom. It was immaculate. The marble floors shone. The portraits on the walls were free of dust, and the air, instead of being stale and musty, carried the faint, clean scent of beeswax and dried lavender. Caspian stepped out with the cold precision of a man reclaiming his domain, but a flicker of confusion marred his composure. This was not the scene of decay he had so vividly imagined. He was shown to his rooms, the master suite he had not slept in for 3 years. Everything was in perfect order. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, chasing away the evening chill. Fresh linens were on the bed, and a decanter of his preferred brandy sat, waiting on a side table. He had sent no word of his specific arrival time. This level of preparation spoke not of resentful servitude, but of a household run with uncanny efficiency. It was unsettling. He dismissed the footman and prowled the room, touching the polished wood of the mantelpiece, his fingers coming away clean. He told himself it was the doing of Blackett, that the old steward was simply maintaining standards. But he knew Blackett. The steward was competent, but lacked initiative. This was something else. But on the 4th day of his reluctant stay, having successfully avoided all contact with his wife by timing his movements with tactical precision, fate finally forced them to meet. He was taking a shortcut through the long gallery that connected the library and the private living quarters when he saw her. She was at the far end, speaking quietly to a maid who was polishing a silver candelabra. She turned as she sensed his presence, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other down the length of the echoing hall. She curtsied perfectly, a quiet figure in a simple, well-worn dress of dove gray. The dress was faded, he noted, yet it was immaculately clean, and suited her slender frame with an elegance that defied its simplicity. "Good morning, my lord," she whispered. her voice as soft as moth wings, carrying easily in the still air. It was the first time she had spoken to him in 3 years. "Madam," he replied, his own voice clipped and cold, the word a barrier. He was determined to maintain the distance, to reinforce the invisible wall between them. He swept past her, a king in his own castle, refusing to acknowledge the presence of another sovereign. He would not notice the scent of lavender and something else, something like wood smoke and old paper that clung to the air around her. He would not acknowledge the unwelcome thought that the simple, faded dress looked more regal on her than the finest silks on the London ladies he knew. And he certainly would not examine the strange, jolting feeling in his chest, a feeling that was not anger, not scorn, but a deeply unsettling premonition that the ghost he had locked away had somehow become the most solid thing in his entire house. The first true crack in Caspian's armor of indifference did not come from a dramatic confrontation or a tearful appeal, but from a quiet moment of eavesdropping. He was making his way to the drawing room, intending to brood over a glass of port, when he heard voices from within. It was the staff. His hand paused on the heavy oak door as he recognized the tones of Mrs. Thorne and 2 of the senior housemaids. They were not gossiping or complaining, as he would have expected. They were speaking with a passion and earnestness that he had never, in his entire life, heard from them. The subject of their discussion was her ladyship. "The new herbs she ordered for the still room have arrived," one maid was saying. "She says the tincture she is devising will be much more effective for treating the miner's cough. She has a better head for remedies than old Dr. Albright," Mrs. Thorne stated, a note of awe in her usually stern voice. "And she got Blackett to agree to the repairs on the tenant cottages near Miller's Fen, said it was a disgrace that Ravenwood men should live in such damp." He didn't even argue. The sheer oddity of it all, the casual praise, the deference, the genuine respect, made him stay, his ear pressed closer to the door. They spoke of how Lydia had organized a rotating schedule so that the younger maids could have an hour each day for reading lessons, how she had personally designed a more efficient system for the laundry, saving hours of back-breaking work. He listened, frozen, as the conversation painted a picture of a woman he did not know, a woman who was intimately involved in the running of his home and the lives of his people. Footsteps approaching down the corridor sent him melting back into the shadows of a tapestry, his heart pounding with a strange mix of emotions. The mystery of their loyalty, a loyalty he had never earned and never even sought, lodged in his mind like a splinter. That evening, the whole carefully constructed illusion of the meek, useless wife shattered completely. Caspian was in the library, feigning interest in a book on animal husbandry, when a commotion erupted in the hall. A young kitchen maid, no more than 16, came running from the direction of the servants' stairs, her face streaked with tears and panic. At that exact moment, Lydia was gliding down the grand staircase, a small basket over her arm, her movements possessing their usual quiet grace. The girl, blinded by her tears, did not see her and collided right into the Countess. Caspian, watching from the shadows of a stone archway, tensed. He expected a sharp reprimand for the girl's clumsiness, perhaps even for her to be dismissed on the spot for daring to touch the lady of the house. Instead, he watched, stunned, as Lydia's free hand shot out, not to push the girl away, but to catch her, steadying her with a firm, gentle grip. "Hush now, Mary. What is it? What has happened?" Lydia's voice was calm, a soothing balm on the girl's raw panic. The maid burst into a fresh torrent of sobs, clinging to Lydia's arm. "It is my father, my lady," she wailed. "He is a miner at the North Quarry. There was a small collapse. His leg is crushed, and he is in a terrible agony. We have no money for a doctor, and Lydia listened with an intense, unwavering focus. She did not offer empty platitudes or dismiss the girl with a coin. She took action. Caspian remained rooted to the spot, a silent observer to a scene he could barely comprehend. He watched as his wife, the woman he had deemed insignificant, sent a groom galloping for the doctor with a signed note guaranteeing his payment. She dispatched another servant to the still room with a list of herbs for a poultice, naming each one with practiced knowledge. She then took the weeping maid into the kitchens, ordered a basket to be filled with bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine, and wrote a note to be included. It was all done with a quiet, unshakable authority that told Caspian This was not a one-time act of charity born of sudden pity. This was a system. This was a well-oiled machine of compassion that she had built, piece by piece, in his absence. The maid finally left, her face, though still pale with worry, now shining with a desperate gratitude. Lydia lingered for a moment by the kitchen door, one hand pressed to her chest, as if to steady herself from the emotional toll. A flicker of deep weariness crossed her face before being replaced by her usual serene composure. She then continued on her way, disappearing down the corridor, leaving Caspian alone in the echoing darkness. He was left with a single, deeply unsettling question that burned through his pride. Who was this woman he had married and so carelessly thrown away? The incident with the kitchen maid had been a revelation, and Caspian found his world tilting on its axis. The following days were a study in covert observation. He walked the halls of his own home like a spy, no longer avoiding his wife, but actively, secretly, seeking her out. He listened at doorways. He watched from the shadows of upper galleries. With every new discovery, the foundations of the world he thought he knew began to crumble and turn to dust. The servants no longer scurried past him with their eyes downcast in fear or resentment. They moved with a purpose and a lightness he had never seen before, often with a quiet smile on their faces. Even the gardens, which he now bothered to walk through, were not the overgrown wilderness he'd expected. The lawns were neatly scythed, and the formal beds, long abandoned, were being reclaimed from the weeds, with new plantings of herbs and flowers laid out in careful, thoughtful patterns. He summoned his steward, Blackett, to his study, under the pretense of reviewing the quarterly accounts. The room, like the rest of the house, was unnervingly clean and organized. Caspian let the steward drone on about crop yields and timber sales before he casually interjected. The household seems to be running smoothly. The staff's morale appears improved. Blackett, who for 3 years had sent Caspian terse, gloomy reports, now looked up from his papers, his weathered face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. Smoothly, my lord. It is a different world entirely. There is a harmony here I've not seen since your grandfather's time. We have her ladyship's care to thank for it all. The old steward's voice was filled with a quiet, profound reverence that was more powerful than any flowery speech. He spoke of how Lydia had settled a long-standing feud between the head groom and the cook, how she had used her own funds to purchase new, warmer blankets for every bed in the servants' quarters, and how she spent hours listening to the tenants' concerns. Blackett saw no need to elaborate. The results spoke for themselves. Determined to see this care for himself, Caspian found his feet leading him toward the long abandoned west wing, drawn by a sound he could not place. It was the faint melodic murmur of children's voices. The sound emanated from the old music room, a chamber that had been covered in dust and silence since his mother's death 15 years prior. He pushed the heavy door, which opened silently on recently oiled hinges. Just a crack, he peeked through, and the scene within stole the breath from his lungs. There was Lydia. She sat on a low stool, the pale afternoon light from the tall windows haloing her dark hair. She was surrounded by a dozen children of various ages, the children of his grooms, his maids, his tenants. A book lay open in her lap. She was patiently leading them through a reading lesson, her voice gentle and encouraging. When one small boy with a smudged face stumbled over a difficult word and looked on the verge of tears, Lydia didn't scold him. She put the book aside, a soft smile touching her lips, and launched into a wildly imaginative story about a sneaky rabbit with a penchant for stealing pies, and a grumpy old owl who was secretly a very bad poet. The room, once a mausoleum of sad memories for Caspian, filled with the bright, clear sound of children's laughter. A small girl, no older than 4, grew bold enough to crawl into her ladyship's lap, and Lydia, without pausing her story, unconsciously began to stroke the child's hair. When she finished the tale, a chorus of tiny voices begged for another, until the oldest boy in the group, the blacksmith's son, stood up and declared with solemn gravity, "The Countess is the kindest lady in all of Yorkshire." The other children cheered in agreement. This was not the simple peasant girl from his disdainful imagination. This was a queen in her own right, holding court not in a throne room, but in a dusty chamber she had single-handedly transformed into a haven of learning and hope. The memory of his wedding day struck him with the force of a physical blow. The cold vows, the way he had refused to look at her. The fact that he had never once asked her what she hoped for, what she dreamed of, or what she feared. It had all been a business transaction. He had paid a debt and locked away the key, never once considering the living, breathing person attached to it. The final, crushing blow to his pride came a few days later, while he was going over the household ledgers in earnest with Blackett. The steward, now openly eager to showcase his lady's virtues, pointed to a separate set of books. "Her ladyship's private accounts, my lord," he said with undisguised admiration. For 3 years, Lydia had been methodically using the personal allowance her father provided, a sum Caspian had sneered at as pocket money, to quietly rebuild his estate from the inside out. There were the new uniforms and the repairs to the servants' quarters he already knew about. But there was so much more. Payments for a new roof on the dairy, a line item for restocking the kitchen with enough provisions to weather a siege, let alone a winter, and a secret, recurring fund designated for village medical needs, which paid for Dr. Albright's services for any family on the estate who could not afford it. Blackett turned a page. "She has the sharpest mind for numbers I have ever encountered, my lord. She found ways to save money we have been wasting for decades and put it where it was most needed." He tapped a column of figures. "There are no expenses here for herself, no lavish gowns, no jewels, no trips or vanities. Every penny has been spent on the well-being of this house and its people." Caspian felt a wave of nausea. He could almost hear his own voice, echoing in his memory from a London dinner party, holding forth on the vulgarity of trade brides and their lack of true nobility. The memory burned with a shame so profound, it felt like a physical sickness. He had mocked her, scorned her, and abandoned her, while she, in her silent, lonely tower, had been more of a ruler to his people and a guardian to his home than he had ever been. The sickness arrived with the autumn rains, a virulent fever that swept through the village and the tenant farms with terrifying speed. It began with chills and a hacking cough, and within days, it left its victims too weak to even lift their heads. Fear, cold and damp as the Yorkshire mist, settled over the estate. Caspian's first instinct was one of aristocratic detachment, to quarantine the hall, to protect himself. He was in his study, contemplating this very course of action, when the door opened without a knock. Lydia stood there, her face pale but resolute. She had already changed from her simple house dress into a practical dark woolen skirt and blouse. "I need your study, my lord," she said. It was not a request. "It is the largest room with the best light. We will need to coordinate supplies from here." Caspian rose to his feet, a protest already forming on his lips. "You will do no such thing. You are not to go down to the village. It is too dangerous." She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the full, unshielded force of her will. It was not the fire of a belligerent spirit, but the immovable strength of a mountain. "For 3 years, I have managed the health of this village with herbs from my garden and funds from my own pocket. These are my people, Caspian. Their welfare is my duty," she said, using his given name for the first time. "Whether you acknowledge that or not is irrelevant. Now, are you going to help me, or are you going to stand in my way?" Her words stripped him of his title, his authority, his pride. In that moment, he was not the Earl of Ravenwood. He was simply a man being shown what true nobility looked like. Humbled, he found himself nodding, a spectator in his own home. He followed her, watching as she transformed his study into a command center, directing servants to gather blankets, herbs, and food. He followed her to the village, intending to forbid her from entering the first cottage, but the words died in his throat as she walked into the stench of sickness without flinching, her very presence a beacon of calm in the terrified gloom. She was a masterful leader. She organized the healthy women, teaching them how to brew the willow bark tea that brought down fevers and how to apply the poultices that eased chest congestion. She established a makeshift infirmary in the village church, directing the placement of cots with the strategic mind of a general. Caspian, the great and powerful earl, found himself relegated to the role of her aide. He carried water, he chopped wood, he held the hands of feverish children, and he listened to her soft, steady voice, offering comfort and commands. As a raw, gray dawn broke after a long night of shared, desperate work, He looked at her exhausted face, smudged with soot and illuminated by a lone candle, and realized a truce had formed between them. A closeness forged in crisis that 3 years of a cold marriage had utterly denied. In the weak morning light, as they walked back toward the hall, his apology finally came. It was not eloquent. It was a broken, clumsy thing, torn from a place of deep, agonizing shame. Lydia, the way I have treated you. The things I thought. I was wrong. I have been a blind and arrogant fool. She listened, her expression unreadable, her exhaustion plain on her face. When she finally spoke, her reply shattered what was left of his heart. I had to find my worth somewhere, she said, her voice quiet but heavy with the weight of 3 lonely silent years. Since I could not find it in your esteem, my lord, I chose to build it for myself here. In that moment, he understood that the prison he had built in the North Tower had not been for her at all. It had been for him, a prison of pride, prejudice, and a profound, unforgivable blindness. The weeks that followed the passing of the fever were a period of quiet, careful rebuilding. The distance between them remained, but it was no longer cold and hostile. It was a space of cautious curiosity. He no longer gave orders, he made requests. He asked her opinion on the new leases. He asked her about the herbs in her garden, and she, in turn, explained their properties with a scholar's passion. He began to sit in on her lessons with the children, watching from the back of the room, marveling at her patience and her gift for storytelling. He listened, truly listened, for the very first time in his life. The real test came a month later. He announced that Blackthorn Hall would host a grand ball, the first in a generation. It was not an act of hubris, but an act of public restitution. He invited gentry from all over the county, including the very friends who had been his audience for his sneering remarks. When Lydia appeared at the top of the grand staircase, she was not in a faded gray dress. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, a dress Caspian had secretly commissioned, its richness complementing her dark hair and the new confidence in her eyes. Around her neck was the Ravenwood diamond necklace, a piece that had not been worn in a century. She was not a merchant's daughter playing dress up. She was every inch the countess. During the ball, Caspian's own aunt, a woman with a tongue as sharp as vinegar, made a catty stage, whispered remark about Lydia's common origins being so well disguised by expensive fabric. Caspian, who would have once agreed, felt a surge of cold fury. He stopped the orchestra. In the sudden, shocked silence, he stood before the entire assembly, took Lydia's hand in his, and raised it for all to see. "Allow me to be clear," he announced, his voice ringing through the hall. "This is Lydia Ravenwood, the Countess of Ravenwood. Any nobility I may claim by birth, she possesses tenfold through her character, her wisdom, and her grace. She saved this house, and she saved its people. She is the finest woman I have ever known, and the true heart of this estate." Later that night, he found her in the moonlit garden. The air was cool, scented with night. Blooming jasmine she had planted, a hesitant vow, spoken in a low voice, finally sealed their new beginning. Their union, at long last, was consummated, not by a cold legal contract, but by a respect that had blossomed into a love that had been hard, won from the ashes of his scorn. Blackthorn Hall, once a monument to decay and pride, bloomed under their true partnership. The shadow bride, the hidden shame, was finally seen for what she had always been, its rightful queen. Her quiet reign of kindness now supported, cherished, and adored by a king who was finally worthy to stand by her side.